Today we're going to look at inflation. Inflation essentially is the sustained increase in aggregate price level. So all prices in society are going up. That's what inflation means. There's some different kinds of it. When you eventually get this handout, there's some creeping inflation. That just means maybe you're going above what stable prices and economic growth would imply. Usually that means 3% or so inflation. When you get to the 5 to the 6 to the 7% rates, it's creeping up a little bit. You'll hear the phrase strato inflation, fairly high, 10 to the 100 or so percent. United States, most recent time in inflation that was problematic is the 1970s, and then hyperinflation, which is essentially making your money worthless. And that's a helpful way to think about the differences between types of inflation and actually what inflation is. Right? Inflation makes your money worth less. Right? If you have a basket of goods today that you can purchase for $100, okay, inflation means that a year from now, that same exact basket of goods costs more than $100. Your money is worth less. Hyperinflation, inflation rates are so high, okay, that the money becomes almost worthless. Your $100 basket of goods a year from now might be literally, and I'm not joking, $24 million. Right? It makes the value of your money worthless. The way you measure inflation is, I guess you could sort of talk about doing it a couple of different ways. One is by looking at something called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, where professional economists look at an average basket of goods, a market basket of goods in society, and compare it over time. Right? They can do that. Another way you can show it is on a diagram, in a typical ADAS diagram. And we talk about inflation two ways. We can talk about it in terms of a demand pull inflation or a cost push inflation. So if you imagine an aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve, right, if aggregate demand shifts up, this could be short run or long run, but more specifically, let's just say this is in the short run, doesn't matter, right, and there's no change in aggregate supply, you're going to see aggregate demand move along the aggregate supply curve and increase prices. So you would have had an equilibrium here with an average price level there. As aggregate demand shifts from AD naught to AD1, okay, we see a new equilibrium point and a new price level, average price level of all goods is increasing. Right, that's demand pull inflation. Aggregate demand, as I come by here, is pulling up average price level. The flip side of that is when aggregate supply causes your increase in the average price level. If you've got an aggregate demand, okay, right here, AD naught, in your first aggregate supply curve, you have an equilibrium point, okay, with your average price level. If there is a negative supply shock, okay, that's going to push aggregate supply to the left, usually short on aggregate supply, creating a new equilibrium, a movement along the aggregate demand curve, causing an increase in overall prices. You are pushing price levels up with your negative supply shock. Right, so we talk about a couple of things in terms of vocab when it comes to your diagram, and it lets you know what is causing the inflation. Was it an aggregate demand issue, or was it an aggregate supply issue? The last thing to keep in mind when it comes to inflation is utilizing the terms real versus nominal. Real, when you put that in front of a number, whether it's wages or GDP, those are the two big ones we'll talk about, means inflation is taken into account. So on one hand, if you say you got a 10% raise in your wages, you don't know if that's a real wage increase or not until you know about inflation. Because if inflation has increased, the average level of price is 20%, your wages didn't go up in real terms. They went up in nominal terms, which is just the number. Nominal is when you take year 1 to year 2 to year 3, and you don't take account into inflation. And so it's the same thing for GDP of a country. If you say the first year you saw GDP of a country is $300 million, and the next year is $330 million, that's an increase of 10%. But if inflation is 20%, you've actually seen negative real GDP growth. Right? Because average price level would jump your $300 million GDP to $360 million GDP just on price level alone. So you want to pay attention to whether the term real or nominal is put in front of a term. Real means inflation has been taken into account. Once again, thank you for listening. Keep your opportunity cost high and your expectations low.